Hello, everyone. Welcome to our January DevSecOps Bunch. It is 2023. We're going to get started in just about a minute. We want to make sure we give people plenty of time to get online with us today. I'm excited to have my friend Dan from Digital.ai joining us today, and we're going to talk about the MASVS team up, Bulletproof mobile security from dev through prod. I think today's session is going to be a great learning journey for all of us. So again, we'll get started in about 30 seconds to a minute. We want to make sure we leave enough time for everybody to join before we get barreling through the content. If you're familiar with the DevSecOps Bunch, it is a monthly webinar series where we have subject matter experts from around the industry. We get together every month, and this month we're a little late because January had a slow start, so we're here at the end of the month. We'll be back again next month with another great session. We'll talk briefly about that at the end of today. And with that, I'm going to look at my watch, and my watch says it's a little bit after 2 o'clock. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Today is the beginning of 2023. It's January. It's the DevSecOps Bunch webinar series. We bring together experts from around the industry to talk about key topics in your DevSecOps journey. Today, we've got the MASVS team up, Bulletproof Mobile Security from Dev through Prod. Joining me today is Dan Shugrue from Digital.ai. And as I jump into the next slide, Dan and I are going to talk today about the state of mobile AppSec. We're going to talk about this idea of the Marvel team up versus the MASVS team up and some word salad. Talk through building blocks of success. We're going to look at a blueprint for success using standards like the OWASP MASVS in your pipeline. We're going to give you an update on MASVS v2 and then some references, some case studies, and then we'll roll into Q&A at the end. Every DevSecOps Bunch is recorded. Within a few days, you'll get a copy of the recording. Every DevSecOps Bunch will also share the content, and there's tons of links to useful information so you can continue your learning journey here. So I'd like to give Dan a chance to introduce himself to all of you. Tell us a little bit about Dan. We'll talk a little bit about Digital.ai and NowSecure. Dan, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Brian. Yeah, so very happy to be here talking about MASVS and OWASP and all things DevSecOps. Yeah, I'm Dan Shugrue. I'm in product at Digital.ai, which is a DevSecOps company that both harmonizes and secures software delivery. And I come to Digital.ai from a couple of big companies. Worked at Microsoft in security, at Akamai in security, and startups as well. CyberX was one small one, Telecall another, both of which had successful exits into those larger companies I mentioned. Looking forward to today.
Thanks again for joining us, Dan, for sharing your learning on the journey today. I'm Brian Reed. I'm the Chief Mobility Officer at NowSecure. You may wonder what those things are. So I've been a Chief Mobility Officer dating back to the days of BlackBerry. And so on my journey, I've been working with organizations about building mobile strategies, whether it was mobile enablement. Today, it's mobile security, mobile app innovation. It's been a great journey for me going back 15, almost 20 years in mobile. And before that, I did a whole lot of stuff in client server, Unix, and mainframe. So NowSecure, a little bit about NowSecure. We're a mobile application security company. We were actually founded in 2009 as a forensics and pen testing company. Over the years, we've developed a whole suite of solutions. Our automated testing for DevSecOps pipelines, our pen testing services, our training and consulting. We really bring a full, well-rounded solution set. We're all things mobile AppSec for you and your organization. We're very excited to work with OWASP. We've helped develop the OWASP mobile project and evolve that project. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the OWASP MASVS. And then we'll talk about the new update, the release candidate for OWASP MASVS v2. We also work with other standards groups like the Google ADA for the MASA, NIAP, IOC, and a bunch of others. So we work a lot in the tool chain, and really our mission is to help you deliver high quality software faster, right? And do it in a way where security becomes a core capability of your entire pipeline and your ability to deliver and be successful with your customers. Quickly in the background, we work with lots of different organizations across lots of different industries, financial services, government, healthcare, or high tech, kind of the who's who of mobile companies. We work with a number of mobile first businesses like an Uber, for example, and a lot of traditional commercial businesses like a Tesla, a Marriott, or an AT&T. A lot of the carriers around the world work with us naturally because the carriers are dependent on mobile devices and apps as well. And we hope to help you out with whatever you're trying to achieve in your organization with how you use mobile apps. Build and deploy those mobile apps to support your user base, your customers, and overall your business growth. So with that, would love to have Dan introduce Digital.ai and a little bit about their customers.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So you mentioned NowSecure is helping companies deliver high quality software faster. We could almost use the same tagline. We're helping companies deliver software more quickly through our agility solutions, through our continuous test solutions, release and deploy. And then, of course, we're helping to secure those applications. We're probably the main difference being that we're approaching security from a different angle, and that's why we can do a team up and be successful. Digital.ai is all about application shielding, or in other words, the obfuscation of software and particularly code, disassembled code, as well as providing the ability for enterprises to monitor software once it's out into the wild, post-production, and to react to attacks through either custom actions or through preset actions, such as shutting down the app when and if it comes under attack. Like NowSecure, we've got a whole bunch of Fortune 500 customers. 50% of the Fortune 500 are actually Digital.ai customers, 1,100 customers total around the world. We're private equity funded, so we've got plenty of deep pockets to fund our development efforts. And together, between the 5 companies that were bought and now make up Digital.ai, we have a combined experience of 50 plus years. And we can just quickly show the logos here. Digital.ai in the next slide. Yeah. So, across all of the major verticals, we are providing agile planning and orchestration, release and deploy, as well as security for some of the companies that you see here.
And so, for both of our organizations, we work with companies large and small, mostly the larger size companies, to be honest with you, because they're the ones that really care about securing and protecting their data, especially in the mobile ecosystem. And if you're familiar with our sessions, we always start with a couple of polls. Now, the polling here is to help Dan and I understand who is here with us today. So we're opening our first poll. Please pick whatever your role is, and you may have a hybrid role, so you can pick more than one here. So we're interested in understanding who our audience is. We're going to ask everybody to please take a quick look at your screen. Take a look at the poll, pick who you are. You might be another, that's fine if you're another. Let us know whether you're on the dev side, the security side, the architecture side, maybe you're a DevOps engineer, what have you. It helps us, again, to sort of understand who's here, and then Dan and I can steer our conversations. So wait another 15 seconds. Again, we'd ask everybody to pick one or two if you happen to cover multiple roles. And with that, if we can convert over to have a look at who's here today, and show results, please. That would be great. Close poll and show results. All right, so we got a whole lot of security people and a couple of others. So thank you for joining us today. We'll go with that. And with that, we will carry on. I'm going to close that poll and move us forward. We have a second poll for you all, which is really asking about what tools and techniques you're using today within your strategy around mobile AppSec. So the part of this is testing oriented. Part of this is strategy oriented in terms of are you using OWASP or not. Part of this has to do with technology, services, and so forth in your organization. So when you think about your AppSec program, many folks on this will be mobile centric, or you may be working with a mobile team, or you're on the website of the house. What kind of techniques are you using today in order to build out your mobile AppSec program? We'll wait 10, 15 seconds so we can give people, again, you have the choice to do multiple choice here. So select all that apply to you. And obviously we think some of you will use OWASP, but those of you who don't, we're going to teach you how and why here as part of today's session. So why don't we close the poll and let's take a look at some results here to see what the crowd has to say today. Good that about half the folks, the less than half, are using OWASP. As you might expect, a lot of people using SAST. Good to see the collection of DAST users as well. We really believe you need static and dynamic testing, and you absolutely need application shielding. And that's why Dan's here to talk to you about things like crypto and app shielding, because you have to harden your data, you have to harden your apps, not just test them as you go. So thank you for answering our first two questions. There will be one more poll later in the end. Now, our chat is open. You can use the Q&A tab or the chat tab to make comments to each other and to ask questions. Dan and I will hit all the questions at the end. So as you think of questions as we go, make sure you hit us up and we'll collect them at the end. So every year we do a benchmark, and I'm in the middle of benchmarking right now. And what I will tell you is this slide looks the same almost every year, which is kind of interesting. So for the last 5 years, 70% or more of all digital time spent online and all internet traffic has come from mobile apps. And so as Dan and I have seen in the market, mobile has become the dominant business, consumer, and user platform. So we need to treat our mobile applications and treat them as first-class citizens and deliver high-quality experiences. You want a great UX, but you also want strong security. The challenge we have is security is lagging. We hear from many organizations that development has raced ahead in mobile innovation and security is left behind. And when you look at our benchmark data for the last 5 years, every single year, at least 85% of all mobile apps have one or more vulnerabilities that fail the OWASP MASVS. That's one or more, and some are pretty horrific. In addition, with strong privacy regulations out now, some 70% of them leak data that would, could, or should violate CCPA for California, GDPR for Europe, or other privacy regimes, and more of those privacy regimes are coming. So we need to be ready for that. So we're in this interesting place where a number of you answered you were doing SAST, and a few of you answered you were doing pen testing, and very few of you said you were doing app shielding. Yet what we're finding is that multitudes of organizations are exposed here because of this weak benchmark data. Now, Dan's got some great data here as well. Tell us about apps under attack.
Yeah, so this was a stat that we discovered in November of last year. We looked at the applications that we protect and found that 55% of them were either run in a debugger or were running modified code or had run modified code in that 7-day period. And what I'm saying here is of the apps we protect, meaning, if one bank is shielding all of the instances of their 30 million apps, if one of those is attacked, that's all obviously an attacker needs in order to breach the bank. So we would count that as 1 out of 1, as opposed to app instances. So just to be clear, it's 55% of the apps we protect, in other words, of our customers' apps, were either running modified code or had been put into debuggers.
Yeah, we're seeing this in breach data. We've got a mobile breach tracker running as well. Last year, there were 5 major breaches that hit the press. And all of those, again, show that the attackers have recognized that the traffic has moved to mobile. They've also recognized that mobile is weak, right? Given the statistics we're given here. So you have a high attack rate and you're not very strong as well. Now, Dan's a huge fan of Marvel Comics. I come from DC Comics, but he's a Marvel guy. So he's going to help me out with this. So we were thinking about, when you're together, it's really a team that's delivering these high quality apps, right? So you've got the architects, you've got dev, you got sec, you got DevOps, you got QA, cast of characters. If you're in a regulated market, you got compliance people, you have your user population and community, you have requirements from product management. So it's kind of this team effort, right, when it comes to application delivery. So if you're younger, then you probably Marvel to you means something like the Avengers, right? You might come from either the Spider-Man side of the house and the Spider-Man family of movies, or kind of the Marvel Avengers side of the house. And what's kind of interesting about it is that's where my kids are, right? They don't know anything about many of these old sort of Marvel characters. Now, Dan's been a Marvel fan for a long time. Tell us more about the classic superheroes here, Dan.
Well, the Marvel team up, it was originally Spidey and it was, I think the first few were Spidey and the Hulk. And the Avengers, at least in my world, didn't come along until much later, and then obviously really blew up in the last 10 years. But the thing about the Marvel team ups that I always kind of liked was the team up was almost always messy. In other words, when the good guys got together, they had to resolve some differences before they really were able to join forces and make a whole greater than the sum of the parts. And I feel like, in many ways, that's what dev and sec and ops are like. They may not necessarily see eye to eye in the beginning. It might be very difficult to forge a creative symbiosis between those groups. But once you do, the whole is much greater than the sum of the parts. You can accomplish much more with your brethren in development if you're in ops, in security if you're in dev, et cetera. And together you can really defeat the bad guys or the threat actors.
And that's, of course, where we're trying to get to. Now, of course, there's this giant Marvel universe now of many, many team ups and many, many different characters. As we kind of look at this, you can think of, if you're a really large enterprise, you might look like this, right? We have customers that have hundreds of pipelines, building hundreds of applications, distributed teams, kind of all over the world. And how do you effectively herd cats in all this? How do you make it so the smaller teams can team up together? Maybe you set up a DevOps dojo so you can get knowledge sharing and best practices boosts. You might be trying to drive security champions across it and so on and so forth. And so as Dan and I were kind of getting together for this session, we realized if it's an MASVS team up, well, it's just like a Marvel team up, right? So it's not just heroes saving the world. It's this hero community in our organization that's saving the world from unsafe mobile apps. And that's really where we're going. Now, I went and did a quick search, and it turns out there's actually a couple of Marvel apps. So I had a little fun putting screenshots of Marvel apps in here. But the reality is it is a team sport, right? And the more we can recognize it's a team sport, that team sport also has superpowers. Those superpowers are the tools and techniques that you use in order to make it work. We're going to talk today about how OWASP is actually the script for your superhero story, right? And so we're going to look to leverage that in our pipelines. Now, as we talk with organizations, I do a lot of speaking, a lot of training around OWASP. We find lots of organizations don't recognize that OWASP is actually the roadmap to success for DevSecOps. They think of it as a thing that security guys read in a dark corner. And we're going to talk today about how you bring it together kind of as a set of building blocks in order to drive your organization effectively. So this session's going to kind of go in two chunks. The first thing is, what is the OWASP MASVS and what do I need to know about it? And then the second chunk is going to be, how do I apply it in a DevSecOps pipeline? So for the next 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to kind of talk about the OWASP MASVS and how it's a successful strategy and set of resources you can use. So the OWASP mobile project was slightly renamed recently. It's now the OWASP MAS, which is the Mobile App Security Project. It is that blueprint here. We strongly recommend that all your stakeholders read it and use it. It is easy to consume, and it is a cookbook or a recipe for how to successfully design, build, and develop, as well as test mobile apps, not just test mobile apps in the traditional way people have viewed it. Now, the great thing about this standard is, imagine a world where you actually have all of those superheroes, all of those stakeholders working together. So they're aligned, and that means that they use a common standard, which means there's predictability of the code they write and the test they execute, which gets you into flywheel repeatability and efficiencies in the team. Right, so it's not just about, am I writing high quality apps, but can I do that predictably, repeatably, and efficiently, right? Because what really matters is I'm delivering apps that people want to understand. So the big thing to remember, and again, a number of organizations where I come in to do cross-functional training, devs say, I don't know what that thing is. Security says that's for me, not for them. We want you to know that everybody working the pipeline should go read the spec, should go look at how it can help them in their particular role. Now, the resources you need, so there's the MASVS, which is the security verification standard. It's basically the cookbook of how should you write a secure app and the core things that ought to be tested. There's the MASTG, which is literally the guidance to test it. So every component of MASVS has a corresponding section in the MASTG. And then you have the mobile security checklist. The mobile security checklist itself is basically a spreadsheet or a PDF that has all the tests in it. So you can download it and use it within your testing criteria as a mechanism to track that you are testing the right things and achieving those tests. What's really cool about some things going on is that where MASVS is at version 1.5 and the version 2.0 release candidate's just about to hit the street. A major refactor was done over the past year. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. As the MASTG evolves, the checklist is automatically dynamically updated in the GitHub repos, so they're really easy to keep them aligned when you leverage them in your organization. Now let's think about an AppSec model. And to think about an AppSec model, we ought to take a step back and think about a threat model and a design model for our organization. So what OWASP MASVS has done has brought us this ability to look at 4 quadrants of application types. So the first application type is really what we call standard security. So work with me on an example. I'm going to look at healthcare applications with varying degrees of risk. So the WebMD mobile app, what is it? It's got a little bit of data in it. It's got no regulatory requirements. It's very simple. There's no authentication, no login, no PII, no PHI, no nothing. So I might want to do just lightweight testing that's known as level 1 basic security. Now, level 2 security is when you're now dealing with regulated data, you're dealing with maybe compliance, and you need to be able to store PII and PHI. So maybe this is a health monitoring app. So I have health issues. I have various health monitoring apps to look at things like my weight, my blood pressure, what have you, right? So it's got PHI in it. It's got an authorized user. I've got multi-factor auth in it, and so on and so forth, right? So it's information about the user, and I want to protect it, and I may be regulated to protect it or not based on the space I'm in. Now, when we talk about security, there's either the standard security or defense in depth security. What about security from the attacker? And Dan had some amazing data about the attack frequency rate. So as we think about this, there's a resiliency layer here. So now let's think about, what if my application is a drug formulary app? So physicians and pharmacists are using this to mix cocktails of drugs for a particular user. Now, there's no PII or PHI in this, but what if somebody gets in there and tampers the data such that the pharmacist now makes a drug improperly, or the physician improperly prescribes it? That could lead to death. So even though it doesn't have personal information in it, we need to make sure the application is resilient such that an attacker can't get in there and manipulate the data that could lead to human harm. Now, that correlates with standard security plus high resilience. Now, of course, I've got L2, which are these defense in depth apps, and they also require high resilience. So now I'm talking about something like a drug delivery system attached to the body, or an advanced diagnostic system, right? Like something from Medline. In this world, not only does it have my PHI in it, it could kill me if someone manipulates the application. So it's got to be resilient enough that the attacker can't get into it and manipulate that application in a way that could lead to human bodily harm, damage, death, or something else like that. And I use the healthcare example because it's a very personal way for us to really understand these levels of security and the level of resilience we need. So as we bring these together, then, L1 is about standard security practices. As a guidance, L2 is really that defense in depth. So that means you're hardened against loss device. That means you're using certificate pinning, right? Especially in a regulated world. That means you're using multi-factor authentication. I mentioned that earlier. That probably means there's actually an architectural set of requirements as well that your company may have specified. Now, resiliency, Dan, tell us a little more about resiliency and what people should be doing.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it was a great example you gave about the pharmacist's app. So there's an app that, like you said, it doesn't store any personally identifiable information, but if the data is tampered with, it can have very dire consequences. I mean, it can affect someone's life, even kill someone. And then likewise, for the example that you gave from Medline, there's an app that, let's say it's a diabetes monitoring app. So it's monitoring your insulin level. If that is tampered with, or something goes wrong, not only is the PII exposed, but again, it's dangerous. The things that we can do to protect against that, anti-tamper is, it's actually, if I mince words here, it's actually not so much the protection against tampering. It's obfuscating the code such that a threat actor can't understand what it is he or she is seeing after they disassemble the code. So, there's tools out there that I'm sure our security people on the call, security analysts, and probably devs as well, that are available to everyone. Tools like Frida, that the NSA originally created and that has been open sourced. Anyone can put any app they find on the App Store and the Play Store into Frida. And if it hasn't been protected through anti-tamper measures, first of all, that detect whether or not the app's been put into Frida, or that obfuscate the code such that when it's reverse engineered, it's no longer understandable, then the data can be changed, whether that's a recipe for a drug like you were mentioning, or it's the information about the insulin level of the patient. So in both cases, obfuscation and anti-tamper work together in order to protect the original code from being tampered with or understood by threat actors.
So as we've seen here, right, we've tried to spell out 4 different scenarios for your application. So in your organization, you should do some basic modeling as you learn from the MASVS and determine which quadrant does each application live in as I'm designing, building, developing, and ultimately testing and shipping, and then make sure I have the right development and security testing strategies along with runtime protection strategies to be successful. And so as we drill into MASVS, so we've looked at the 4 quadrants, let's look at the domains, right? And again, if you come from an architecture-based background or a development-based background or a security background, these should sound familiar. So do you have the right architecture, and have you threat modeled your app? What are you doing to protect storage and test storage? So storage and privacy. What about crypto? What about authentication and session management? What about network communication, environmental interaction? Code quality and build settings. We find something like 8% of apps in the App Store still have debug code in them. Good Lord. And then, of course, you've got the resiliency against reverse engineering that Dan just dug into, right? So a holistic and successful high-quality mobile application development, testing, and delivery program will address all 8 of these, from architecture through development, design, testing, pre-production, and production throughout the application lifecycle. Now, we could spend hours in a training going through every single one of these, but we thought it'd be interesting to look at which ones are most frequently found to be vulnerable or done incorrectly, so we can give you kind of a cookbook to which ones you might want to focus on in your organization. We're guessing that all of you probably have mobile apps already. So let's talk about how we use them in dev and sec, and then look at the 5 most common issues we find in the millions of apps in the App Store. So when we take those requirements, we can break them down, right? So you've basically got 6 requirements that really focus on the client side: architecture, code, crypto, platform, storage, and resiliency. Then you've got network, which is your transmission layer, and you've got auth on the back end. The great thing about it is straight out of the MASVS, you can get the declarations of what you should do in writing code, you should do with crypto, you should do it with platform. Now we're going to give you some more guidelines to make sure it's painfully clear here today in the next section. Now, from a security perspective, we need to think about the attacker patterns, right? So dev's got their guidelines. Well, what are the attackers doing? And again, you can see that the 8 controls now are distributed across application code, architecture, data in use, the backend APIs, data at rest, and data in motion. Now, we could try to cover backend APIs in the MASVS, but why do that? Go to the API spec from OWASP and go to the AVS spec, right? You should be testing the backend APIs independent of mobile or web anyway. There is an emerging API project. We encourage you to get involved in it. The SVS is also going up through some updates related to the back end. So leverage the other OWASP specs to help you with that. And the MASVS will help you with the other ones here, as you see in the diagram. So we've looked a little bit about the dev point of view and the app architecture. We're looking at the sec point of view and the threat model. What we'd like to do is dig into the top 5 scariest places. So what I mean by that is that benchmark data I talked about earlier, where we talked about 85% of all mobile apps are vulnerable, we map them to the 8 controls of the MASVS. So this is in reverse stack rank order, meaning this guy's the worst. So we find that 50% of applications have storage failure, according to the MASVS and the MASTG. Now, in here, we've included links for you to come back in the future. So when you get a copy of the deck, you can click through these links. So your first link is the link to insecure storage. The second link is the V3 for crypto. There's 2 great chapters on that in the MASVS. But we're also providing you with links back to Apple iOS documentation and Google Android documentation. So here, these are reference links for both your dev and sec teams to go back and say, well, how does the Android developer guide tell me to write this? How does the iOS developer guide tell me to write this? So we encourage you to use these resources in your organization. So let's take a look at these guys, in practical form. So developers should encrypt their data, use at least SHA-3 and 4096 bits. You should definitely be using random generation. You should be avoiding any kind of write. A lot of developers will log everything they can because they might need it for later, for debugging or whatever else. If you do that during development, make sure you take it out when you get to prod. We find a lot of issues in terms of sensitive data being written that really didn't have to. And make sure you're using the native operating system config for secure data storage. So Dan, crypto is a key part of this, right?
Yeah, so not only do you want to encrypt the data, but ideally, and some of our biggest, say gaming customers, banking customers who have highly sensitive data, will want to use white box crypto to encrypt their data. And that is the data at rest. Whether it's something that was against best practices stored to the device, or it's a key. A lot of our customers prefer to use the white box crypto standards that we provide in order to provide an extra layer of resiliency.
As we said before, the reverse engineering tools are getting pretty good, especially at cracking weak crypto. So we definitely recommend that. Now, that's the dev guide, right? To include white box crypto SDK, make sure you use the right APIs as defined in the Android and the iOS documentation. For the security side of the house, it's straightforward testing here. Like, look for creds and PI and files, logs, and the IPC. There's a lot of data leaked in the log files, and those log files may be accessible by other applications or nefarious actors. Make sure your crypto is running correctly. Make sure you're dealing with storage. And really, as a hygiene strategy, you should make sure that your app only runs on devices with a password. Devices without a password are easier, obviously, to break into and steal information. It's an easy API call on iOS and Android to make sure that the app unloads itself if the device is not protected by a password. Now, from a DevSecOps perspective, then what you're looking for is automated and continuous testing. Today, we recommend SAST, DAST, and IAST running in the pipeline so that you're testing every build every day throughout the life cycle. Now, leave the application shielding off during your daily development cycle, but then before you go into staging, turn on your application shielding, retest the app to make sure your app is protected. Dan, when and how do we plug in that application shielding?
Yeah, it's perfect. So it's essentially just after the build stage, either a security engineer or a build engineer would apply the protection blueprint to the compiled code, and out would come a protected app. In other words, an app that, once it's disassembled, the code is obfuscated, and in addition, things like keys are not only encrypted, but there's no clues in the code showing where the keys are stored.
So that's V2, that's V3. Take advantage of the links. We're going to move into V4 with authentication and session management. Now, the good news is that authentication and session management is pretty good. So we have a link to V4. We have the link to iOS and Android documentation. Developers, make sure you terminate active sessions. Don't leave them running. Long-running active sessions, the attacker can try to exploit. When a session, when an app or a session is invalidated, moves in the background, make sure the data is hidden. That's easy to configure. Make sure you double check. You run your authorization checks for roles on the server side. We have had a number of customers we pen tested or automatically tested where they were doing permissioning and authentication on the client side. You do not want the attackers to find the mechanism by which you do that they can then use to generate their own credentials and attack the back end. So from a security perspective, test that validation, test that data in memory, of course, anything related to the routines where you're doing authentication and session management. The only way to really test this is through dynamic testing. So you can do automated DAST and IAST in the pipeline. You can run authenticated automated testing. You can also use periodic pen testing or guided testing, which is a level of human-assisted automation in the pipeline in order to make sure that your authentication is tested well. The good news here with V4 is that a very low percentage of apps we found issues with, which I can invert that and say, most of you are doing a great job. Network is the next worst. So we're at V5, moving our way through. Network communication, again, insecure communication means attackers can intercept on the network, whether they have full control of the network or not. Link to V5 here again around network communications. It's one of the larger chapters in OWASP. There's great documentation from Apple and Google related to this. It's very strong for developers to really understand what's going on, including what is certificate pinning and how to use certificate pinning and so on and so forth. So what we recommend for developers, if you are carrying regulated high-value IP or PII or PHI, make sure you're using certificate pinning as the strongest way to pin the app to the back-end server. iOS and Android each have a set of APIs you should be using. So if you're on iOS, you should be using App Transport Security or ATS. If you're on Android, you should be using NSC or Network Security Configuration as well. Those APIs are well explained inside the Android and iOS documentation. Think of it this way. If I turn on ATS and I turn on network security configuration, it's going to do 90% of the network work for me in a single network call, which is much more ideal than using any third-party library or other native OS insecure mechanisms. Now, crypto is just as important for network communication, right, Dan?
Yeah, it is. So, and one of the things that people using white box crypto may not necessarily realize is that it can be used not just for the data at rest, but also for the calls to the libraries and routines from the app to those libraries and routines. And so white box crypto is used, again, to encrypt the communications between the app and the outside routines. And if you're using a white box crypto package, you just want to make sure that you can do that as well as encrypt your data at rest.
So that's it. That's the dev guide. Let's go through security rights. You want to test your TLS pipe. Make sure you look at certificate pinning. Look for zip files in transit. Some of those pharmaceutical apps, for example, use zip files in transit. And if it's an insecure app, non-resilient app, that data could be intercepted and manipulated before it's loaded in the app. It's easy to check for use of ATS and NSC within iOS and Android. It's a simple code review will find that, or static test. And of course, you need to look at third-party libraries. There's a lot of use of third-party libraries around network communication. We find lots of vulnerabilities in those and some malware as well. So from a DevSecOps perspective, it's the two things, right? Make sure you're doing continuous dynamic testing. Static application security testing will not successfully verify your network communication. The only way to really test network communication is through dynamic pen testing or automated testing. So DAST and IAST are necessary to do that. You can do it automated in the pipeline. You can do it with manual pen tests. And of course, you need to shield your applications on the network level as well, right, Dan?
That's right. So yeah, I mean, it's a very good point about dynamic versus static, because we tend to find relatively few customers or companies who are doing the dynamic testing, and then shielding. You know, similar to what I was saying about dev. I mean, we're talking in this particular case about shielding the communications as opposed to shielding the calls, that is, as opposed to the data at rest, and that's I'm not sure if everybody knows that but shielding itself is used both to protect the static code as well as to protect the network communications. In other words, it makes it more difficult to understand the network communications if someone has tapped into the network and is listening to the communications.
Yeah, protect yourself from burp and other network sampling tools. So two more here. So we're going to look at V7. So code quality and build settings. 47% of mobile apps that we test have code quality issues. So if you're tracking it, 50% have storage, 48% have network, 47% have code quality issues. So again, take a look at V7. There's a variety of code quality recommendations. Some of the stuff is pretty simple, right? Simple, like, remove debug symbols, make sure they're following the best coding practices. You should have some internally, whether you're using third-party ones. And make sure you're using native security features, right? So stack protection exists on iOS and Android, leverage ARC and other strategies that iOS and Android provide to you in order to protect the app. So from a security perspective, right, when you're testing, make sure you're using a signed invalid cert, make sure it's not a debug build, look for hard-coded keys. Error conditions and over logging or overly verbose logging is where we find a lot of issues. Right, developers often build for the happy path. They don't necessarily design for the failure path. And the failure path is what the reverse engineer or the attacker is going to use a lot, trying to figure out what's going on, and now they can get all the way in. Finally, third-party libraries are commonly full of bad code. So even if your developers are writing great first-party code, you need to make sure you check those third-party libraries as well. One way to do this is continuous SAST. Interestingly enough, DAST and IAST find a number of code quality issues at runtime. With SAST, you don't know what code's going to get executed. With DAST, it actually gets executed, and oftentimes it's the DAST or the IAST that finds the issues in the third-party libraries where you maybe couldn't see or couldn't manipulate the source code. So make sure you pay attention to this one. Now, the last area here is really around resiliency. I'm going to hand that off to Dan to tell us about resiliency. I will say that our data shows that only about a third of applications have issues with resiliency. So the good news is a lot of organizations are trying to do the right thing, but the reality is not enough for doing the right thing. So Dan, tell us about resiliency.
Yes, yeah, thanks. So as we were mentioning at the very, very beginning, it tends to be the larger organizations that are either, I guess, have the time or the revenue to apply resiliency. And in a word, what we're talking about here is we're talking about applying obfuscations to the code. We're talking about applying the ability to monitor apps that are out into the wild, which is something that's it's very difficult to do, for obvious reasons. If you're outside of the firewall, what tools are you going to use to protect the apps that your company is making? And unless you've built something into the code that allows you to monitor those apps, once they're out, they're gone. And then the last thing is the ability to react to attacks. Those are the sort of the three pillars of building in resiliency, as noted in the OWASP MASVS, and those are things that although it is mostly the bigger companies that are availing themselves of those tools, it's not necessarily only the bigger companies that can do that. There are open source tools that allow you to apply obfuscations to code, and there are open source tools that allow you to provide apply some of the monitoring capabilities and even some of the more basic reaction capabilities. So you can get started with that by downloading the OS tools from GitHub, and then when and if you want to go the next step, you can get something from a commercial provider.
So with that, taking a look at the clock, we're going to pick up speed a little bit because we wanted to make sure everybody really understood the components of the OWASP MASVS specification. Now we're going to talk about using it in practice in your pipeline. As I said before, most organizations that get in front of think the OWASP MASVS is for security teams. The reality is for your entire team. So here's our classic pipeline. If you're familiar with our DevSecOps bunch, we start with this pipeline diagram all the time. So establish some standards for how your teams are going to operate cross-functionally. Skill those teams up on what they need to know about security and quality. Make sure you write good quality requirements. You write your code, you commit your code, you do builds, you test, rinse and repeat. That's your fast feedback loops. Eventually you get to stage, deploy, and monitor. Because we're talking mobile, there's a lot of Xcode and Android Studio. And because we're talking mobile, there's a lot of App Store and Google Play as well as a deployment model. So when we think about leveraging the OWASP MASVS, we're going to see that almost every stage in the pipeline, there's something we can actually leverage from the OWASP mobile project and MASVS. So let's start with use the spec to educate your team and to set policy in the pipeline. So in our products, you can configure MASVS as a standard specification, and that can operate as a policy. That policy can cover the dev side and what the devs are going to do, and the sec side, what the security team is going to do through the QA process. So leverage the standards at the policy level. The second thing is around training. There's excellent training resources available in the industry, so take advantage of that. Whether it's NowSecure Academy, local OWASP events, online OWASP resources, do the training on the MASVS and MASTG so that you can figure out what's the best way to write code, what's the best way to test code and architect that code through your pipeline. Now, crypto, I'm going to hand that to you, Dan. Dan, you're on mute.
Very sorry. Taking up precious minutes there. So yeah, very quickly, this is the stage at which a developer can encrypt their data and their keys to ensure that it's safe from attack.
And as we continue on then, right, we want continuous testing in the pipeline. So you want to automate that testing, you can do that on demand, but most organizations will plug that into their CI/CD infrastructure. They'll automatically test it. They'll pipe remediation back to developers. So you get this fast feedback loop. And really with mobile, you should be automatically testing every build every day. Now, there are scenarios where you need a pen test. There are things that can't be automated. You can't automate multi-factor authentication and CAPTCHA testing. You can't necessarily automate things like IoT Bluetooth connections. So if you can automate 80 or 90% of them in the prior spec, in the prior step, then here you need to factor in periodic manual pen testing or guided testing to make sure you get that depth of coverage for the non-automatable parts of your pipeline. The good news is modern technology, whether it's NowSecure or others, can do 89% of the testing in an automated fashion. Now, shielding is just as important, right, Dan?
Yeah, so this is just to sort of remind that the shielding is happening on 3 levels. It's one, it's obfuscating the code after build, and just in most cases just before test. It's providing the ability to look for signs of tampering or code manipulation. In other words, put in this insecure environment, or the actual code has been changed, and then its ability to react to attacks once the app is put out into the wild outside of the firewall. Something that's fairly rare in many enterprise environments.
Yeah, and so now what we're looking at is we're actually leveraging the OWASP guide and then applying the techniques at almost every stage of the cycle. We haven't even gotten to how do you secure the pipeline itself, which is a whole different conversation. So when you bring it together, our case studies show that you get faster release cycles because you're getting fast feedback loops, fast detection early in the cycle with fast remediation. So that can lop off literally days and weeks in the release cycle. We have customers who release every day or every week, doing continuous testing on the daily builds. You squeeze out risk, right? So your vulnerability escape defect rate goes down. You're writing higher quality code. Your testing is finding the things. You've got better protections, be it crypto or the shielding while you're running in production. Now, if it's cheaper, if I can build things faster and test things faster, I save money, right? Not only do I make money faster because I release faster, but I'm actually lowering my cost of delivery. And the great thing about the OWASP spec is it's basically a recipe for efficiency. How do I get everybody on the same page? How do I determine what security requirements there are? And then how do I get dev to use them to write their code, DevOps to use them to configure the pipeline, security teams to test the code and protect the code, and then it all works much more efficiently in that pipeline. And we'll tell you about that in some case studies that are coming up. Now, we've talked largely about best practices, just two short slides here to talk about product suite. So NowSecure platform is a DevSecOps pipeline automated testing tool. It brings SaaS test, IS, and API security testing into your pipelines. It covers the supply chain and the third-party code you use, as well as the first-party code you use as well. Now, we provide training through NowSecure Academy. So any of you today can go to academy.nowsecure.com and sign up for free training. I've got a link for that later. Whether you're a developer and you want to learn secure coding practices, whether you're an architect for secure design practices, or security analyst who want to learn how to do mobile pen testing, there's courses there that are free for you. And then finally, we have the NowSecure pen testing as a service. So when you need that more complicated advanced testing, we offer expert pen testing that can run once or be continuous expert pen testing throughout the life cycle of your app. If you're an L2 app, you should be doing automated and continuous security testing. If you're an L2R app, you've got to use proper crypto and application shielding to make it work. So Dan, a little bit about your portfolio.
Yeah, so we provide most of the services that we've been talking about throughout the beginning of this presentation. So the ability to protect your app through obfuscation, the ability to monitor through an app-aware threat monitoring tool, and the ability to react either by forcing step-up authentication, shutting down the app when we see signs of tampering, or performing a custom action. We have one gaming company that actually switched the gravity setting to 0 when they discovered an attack, which effectively made the players float off the field. So when you have these 3 steps, you can prevent unwanted tampering, you can detect when the app's put in an unsafe environment, you can monitor changes to code, and then finally you can deter actions through custom actions like the one I just described. And ultimately, that's part of your RASP, or your runtime application self-protection, where the application automatically takes an action based on what you've coded into it post-build.
So we'll have follow-up information for you to learn more about our mutual products and services. Our goal today is to really train you on what's going on. I'm going to spend about 2 minutes on MASVS v2. MASVS v2 is in release candidate now. It's expected to be ratified and commercially released at the OWASP Global AppSec event in Dublin in the middle of February. So stay tuned for more news from the OWASP team, the OWASP Mobile Project, and Dublin. So working through the refactor, it's all about improving the quality of the spec. The original spec came out in 2017 and 2019. There's been a lot of learnings over time. There's been a lot of suggested refinements over time. So we spent the last 12 months, 1 month at a time, refactoring every single stage or every single of the 8 controls throughout the process. It's been a rigorous community project. Sven and Carlos have driven the project along with a number of really great contributors throughout the world. And so in the refactoring, a couple of big things to be aware of. So architecture has been removed. There, as a group, OWASP specs are moving towards NIST in a number of standard areas. So they recommend you use NIST 800-218 and the OWASP SAM strategy. So architecture is being removed from mobile. Go to the standard architecture resources for all your application infrastructure. Storage is condensed, and some things in storage really belong in platform and vice versa. Some things in platform belong in storage, cleaned up. Simplified crypto, Dan's been talking about that today. Separated client side and server side. So on the server side for authentication, that really should be handled by the AVS. Simplified network, but a lot of the tests are still in there. And then some other things around code and resiliency have been simplified and streamlined as well. So on this prior slide, there's a link to the refactoring, which is parallel to the production specs. We encourage you to have a look at that. If you want a deeper dive, if you've got some experience as well, take a look. There's a lot of great things happening with it. We will be coming back mid-February with a major update. There is a release guide that will walk you through the changes and how you can implement them and deploy them within your particular organization. So bringing it all together, we believe that Digital.ai and NowSecure provide that full suite of everything you need to deliver those high-quality apps faster from dev through production. Dan, want to summarize how Digital.ai brings this together?
Yeah, so we're helping organizations meet the resiliency requirement in the OWASP. So the right-hand side of that good slide that Brian showed earlier, and we're doing that by helping companies obfuscate their code, helping them monitor apps that they put out into the wild, and helping them to react to attacks by, say, for example, shutting down the app or forcing step-up authentication.
And from the NowSecure side, as I said, we've been here since the birth of the OWASP mobile project. We're an OWASP MAS advocate. We bring together everything you need to deliver higher quality apps faster. Building that security in, write better code is really our strategy, and make that code be protected at runtime with our partner, Digital.ai. So again, we are heroes saving the world, and moving from the Marvel team up, we're now in the OWASP team up, and we encourage you to team across your organization to be successful in delivering what you need to do to serve your customers. So reminder, we're going to Q&A in just a minute here. We'd like to ask our last poll, and then we got a case study and some shared information for you. So if we can open up the poll there, what are the topics you would like to investigate further? So we are interested in which of our topics was most valuable to you today. Which ones are you interested in more information on? Which ones do you think will be most valuable to your org? So you can check any of these. We encourage you to look into all of them, but we're interested in what things caught your eye as places and initiatives. We're evolving some benchmarks. We got a new set of benchmark research we're going to be doing. So we're using this to help steer where should we be doing research and polling and industry benchmarking related to some of these topics. So we appreciate you taking a second to tell us what was most interesting to you that you are going to want to go research more. So wait about 5 seconds, 10 seconds here, and then Jessica can flip us over to the answers. Again, reminder to use the Q&A tab to ask Dan and I questions. So let's have a look at the polling results. All right, so automated testing in the pipeline, the project itself, very good. Crypto and shielding, definitely. If you're not doing it, dig into those. So again, our goal is to make you successful with a holistic solution set. Whether you work with NowSecure and Digital.ai or somebody else, recognize the OWASP MASVS is your blueprint. We encourage you to use it. Dan, you want to tell us about how one of your customers have leveraged this and the gains they've received?
Yeah, so this is one of the major medical device customers that just so happens to be, one of the enterprises just so happens to be our customer. This is an app on which, literally human life depends. Somebody who had IP stolen in the past, who has FDA overseeing their production of apps, and they're using application shielding to provide the resiliency in order to ensure that patients are able to communicate through their apps with their physicians in a secure manner. And by applying app shielding techniques, this particular customer is avoiding extra delays and getting FDA approval. They've actually grown their business through this app to over $5.5 billion annually. And they've realized $36 million in additional, or I should say marginal profits by using an app that doesn't require, or that makes the development pipeline more efficient, as you were mentioning earlier.
So you've got some resources for the audience here?
Yeah. So if in case there are pieces of this that people aren't clear on, or if the folks who are on this call need to convince the other people in the organization to try some of the things that OWASP recommends in terms of resiliency, there's a 4-minute video on the left here. So 4 minutes, anyone who's doubting or has objections to trying app shielding can learn about the benefits of doing so and how app shielding is applied in just 4 minutes. If you want to go a little bit deeper, you can look at what a disassembled app looks like in, for example, Frida and Ghidra. What a control flow looks like, both before and after it's been obfuscated, for example. And if you have, if you're managing a variety of development teams and you're wondering, hey, I'm going to obfuscate, I buy that what OWASP is selling, in other words, we need to do this in order to protect ourselves. But I want to know, what are the languages that are easier to obfuscate or actually, lend themselves to obfuscation. In other words, they're more difficult for threat actors to understand once they've been disassembled. And that's a blog post that's at digital.ai/techbrief, where you can see, what do these languages look like once they've been disassembled and they've been obfuscated.
So briefly, all of these organizations here have the same thing, which is they're looking to standardize security and bring automation into their pipelines. And Allstate's a great example. They've taken advantage of implementing the OWASP MASVS and chunks of the MASTG in their pipeline. It's fully automated controls. They're running their pipeline. We encourage you to have a look at that as a strategy. It really is possible to do dynamic in the pipe. So there's a link here to NowSecure Academy, academy.nowsecure.com. Encourage you to do it. We're doing a ton with GitHub. Dan mentioned, use GitHub natively. We've got native security testing inside of GitHub. And for those of you maybe from the web side of the house still learning your way into mobile, we have some folks like that look like they signed up. There's a great resource here for you to learn the difference between web and mobile. So it's time for Q&A. Dan, we've had a couple of questions here, so let me take a look real quick. And so with that, Dan, I'm going to ask you the first question coming in from the Q&A. What are the big differences for Digital.ai and AppDome?
That's a good question. Yeah. So, so first of all, I would recommend if someone's not applying resiliency, they should use any of the resiliency products. The difference between Digital.ai and AppDome is Digital.ai is a technology that has 6 different patents for obfuscation. It has a white box crypto product that's FIPS 140-3 under test. Neither of those things are things that AppDome has. And I don't believe, although I haven't looked at their portfolio for a while, I don't believe AppDome has the monitoring capabilities the Digital.ai has. So there's 3 off the bat.
Yeah, no, I know they don't, believe they don't have the monitoring based on what I've seen and heard in the market as well. So, but one way or the other, use something, please, to protect your apps, because reversing and attackers are there. So I'll take the next question. DAST is typically manual. How do you automate in the pipeline? That's a really good question, right? So most pipeline automated testing is typically SAST, looking at the code repo, check in on push or pull, or SCA. DAST is actually possible because of the unique IP and the patented technology we built. So we actually have an automation engine that installs and runs on physical devices. So we take your binary, we stick it on a mobile device. There's an engine that drives it, and those runners that drive it actually navigate the app. Now, depending on how you want to navigate the app, either the bot can do it automatically, or you can have our human do it through a guided test, depending on the particular scenario you have. If it's multi-factor auth, there's no automation that'll get past all of the multi-factor auth tools. So a human will step through the auth, and then the automated bot will continue doing the rest of the work. So it's really amazing to see these things run. We've got racks and racks of these devices running automatically in our cloud. And so that DAST is really where that unique value is. And as I said earlier, DAST finds the bulk of the storage and network issues, which we described earlier as the top 2 most frequent issues. So a lot of organizations aren't doing dynamic DAST. Come to NowSecure, we can help you with that. This is a fun one. I can barely get my dev team to adopt OWASP L1. How can I get them to think about resiliency? So how do we talk our development friends into investing in resiliency?
Right. Baby steps, right? So, most organizations do tackle the SAST first. The thing about app shielding that's developer friendly is that the developers don't have to change the way they code in order to apply the obfuscations, because they happen after build, as I was intimating earlier in the presentation. So, from an engineer or a coder perspective, it's really sort of there's really no sweat to adding obfuscation. It's going to happen after they code anyway.
Very good. All right. Looks like we have time for maybe one more. Will NowSecure ISDAST work after the app has been protected with products like Digital.ai? So I'll take this one, Dan, and we'll kind of close it out. The answer is sort of. So NowSecure, we recommend you use NowSecure to test the app before you inject the app shielding, right? Make sure your app passes all of your security requirements before you insert the shielding, and then recompile and then test it again, right? And so, or post-build. So what a lot of our customers will do is they'll run NowSecure through the pipeline continuously. They'll get the solid application they want, passes all their test criteria. Then they insert the shielding. Then they run NowSecure again. And they make sure that NowSecure doesn't find any new holes, right? Which we likely won't. And the advanced anti-tampering that Digital.ai brings to the table will make it very hard for us to tear down the app, because of the nature of the protections that they inject. So make sure you test first, then shield, then test again, right? And that way you get a complete view of what you're trying to do. We know some organizations struggle because developers won't give the security team a build without the shielding. And of course, the shielding's in place. It is anti-tampering. It's going to be really hard for a pen testing team or anybody to test the security of a tool or an app when the app inherently has anti-tampering. So you need an SLA with development, give you a build without, then do a build with. So we're going to share with you the information from today. There's actually one last question. Let me take a quick read of it that popped in. It's just really the president app should check for device pin. Most developers will never sacrifice app access. The more important question. Okay, so the question becomes, I made the suggestion earlier that your app should check whether there's a device pin, and if there's not a device pin, the app should unload. So it's a risk-based decision for your organization. It's easier for someone to break into your application if there's no controls on a device, and it's easier for them to break into an application if that device is actually stolen from someone else, right? Because there's no protection on it. So it's a risk-based decision, right? So we have organizations, for example, who used to allow their apps to run on jailbroken and rooted devices. And you would know them because they're major food service and convenience store companies. And they used to allow their apps to run on any device, jailbroken, rooted, or not. And guess what? They were breached. People's food and groceries and money were stolen. So both of those vendors now detect for jailbroken devices or rooted devices, and they unload. Now, there's a whole collection of people who've complained in that ecosystem that prefer that choice of, well, I want to have a jailbroken device or a rooted device, and I still want those vendors' applications to run. They made a risk-adjusted decision that said, no, we're not going to let you run on those devices, even though you might not buy food from us or stop at our convenience store, because we've had material breaches in that direction, and we don't want that to happen. So educate your development team. It's actually a product management and business decision about whether or not you should be protecting your app for running on a jailbroken or rooted device, or protecting them from having a PIN code on the device or not. So that's a great question. Happy to talk more offline. I ran us a little bit over the top. I want to thank Dan a bunch for joining us today. As I said earlier, everything's been recorded and will be shared back to you. Within a few days, you'll also get a copy of the slides that you saw today in PDF. All those embedded links in there, you'll be able to find your way through to get to more resources. We encourage you to take advantage of it. Some of you may have signed up for multiple DevSecOps bunch. If you have, great, please come back. And if you haven't, please come sign up. We will have DevSecOps bunch just about every month this year. Next month, we have Bitrise joining us. We're talking about screaming fast mobile CI/CD pipelines with security built in. So today we looked at crypto and shielding and OWASP. Next month, we're going to look at pipelines when you've got a mobile-specific CI and a mobile-specific testing environment. So join us for more mobile fun next month. Thanks again to Dan and Digital.ai for joining us. We wish you a great week and good luck in building your mobile AppSec program in your organization. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everybody.